LAX was bustling with activity as Valerie Adams, a composed 35-year-old woman, waited patiently in the security line. Dressed modestly in a simple blouse and jeans, she carried a worn suitcase that hinted at a practical, no-frills traveler. The usual hum of conversation faded for her until a sharp voice broke the monotony. "You there! Step forward!" barked Cole Peterson, a middle-aged security officer with a commanding tone. His eyes locked onto Valerie with a scrutinizing glare. Valerie hesitated but complied, her calm exterior masking a growing unease. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice measured. "Random check," Cole said curtly, gesturing toward her bag. "Full body search too." Valerie frowned. "A full body search? What's the reason?" Cole leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to seem sinister. "You don't get to ask questions. Step aside." She obeyed, albeit reluctantly, feeling the weight of curious and judgmental stares from the growing line behind her. As Cole began his inspection, his hands lingered inappropriately, clearly crossing professional boundaries. Valerie recoiled, her voice sharp. "Don't touch me like that," she snapped, stepping back. Cole smirked, unbothered by her protest. "You people always think you're above the rules." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Some passengers exchanged knowing looks, while others whispered audibly. "She's probably hiding something," one man muttered. Another sneered, "Probably married to some thug." Valerie's jaw tightened. "You're all just going to stand here and watch this?" she shouted. "He's assaulting me!" But Cole's smirk only widened. "You should be grateful I'm doing my job. You black women love dressing provocatively, hoping someone will notice." Valerie's cheeks burned with fury, her heart pounding. "You will regret this," she said, pulling out her phone. "Oh, really?" Cole laughed. "Who are you calling? Your imaginary lawyer?" Ignoring him, Valerie dialed. "Jonathan, I need you at security now." The crowd's murmurs grew curious as she hung up. Cole crossed his arms, still smug. What's he gonna do? Save the day? Minutes later, the crowd parted as a tall, imposing man in a tailored suit strode into the room. Jonathan Adams, Valerie's husband and the airport's director, exuded authority with every step. His sharp gaze swept the scene, landing on his wife's torn composure and Cole's defiant stance. "Valerie," Jonathan said, his voice steady. "What happened?" Her voice cracked slightly as she explained. "He humiliated me. He touched me inappropriately under the guise of a search." Jonathan turned to Cole, his jaw tightening. "You assaulted my wife?" Cole hesitated, faltering under the weight of Jonathan's gaze. "I was just following protocol." Jonathan's tone dropped, cold and firm. "You call that protocol? Apologize to her immediately." Cole scoffed. "I didn't do anything wrong." Jonathan stepped closer, towering over him. "Then leave. You're fired. I'll ensure legal action follows." As Cole slunk away, the crowd watched in stunned silence. Before Jonathan could address Valerie further, Amanda Clark, the deputy director, arrived. Blonde and impeccably dressed, Amanda carried herself with calculated precision. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice clipped. Jonathan gestured toward Valerie. "My wife was harassed by a staff member. I need this matter handled appropriately." Amanda nodded. "Of course. I'll make sure it's thoroughly investigated." Just then, another officer approached, carrying a small, sealed bag of white powder. His expression was grim. "Sir, we found this in her luggage." The crowd gasped. Valerie's breath caught. "That's not mine," she exclaimed, her voice rising. "This is a setup." Amanda's gaze lingered on Valerie for a moment before addressing the room. "This changes everything. Mrs. Adams needs to be detained." "What?" Jonathan said, stunned. "You can't be serious." "Drugs in passenger luggage are a serious offense," Amanda said smoothly. "We have to follow procedure." The officers moved in to handcuff Valerie. "Jonathan, you know I didn't do this!" she cried as they pulled her away. Jonathan stood frozen, his mind spinning as the crowd erupted with murmurs of scandal and accusations. Amanda's sharp smile faded into the crowd, but the glint in her eyes lingered like a shadow of something far more sinister. The media erupted hours after Valerie Adams' arrest. Headlines splashed across screens. Airport director's wife caught with drugs. Social media fanned the flames, with hashtags trending and opinions polarizing. Protesters began gathering outside the Adams home, their chants a mix of racial outrage and calls for resignation. Jonathan Adams sat at his desk late that night, staring at his phone. The messages from board members, lawyers, and journalists blurred together. He glanced out the window, where the flashing lights of cameras illuminated signs demanding justice or condemning his leadership. At the detention facility, Valerie waited, anxiety gnawing at her. Her usually composed demeanor was replaced by simmering anger. She replayed the moment the drugs were discovered in her luggage. It didn't add up. She clenched her fists. Someone set me up, she thought. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at the facility. "I need to see my wife," he told the officer at the front desk. After a tense pause, he was led to Valerie, who sat in a small gray-walled holding room. Her face lit up briefly, but anger returned as soon as she spoke. "Jonathan, you have to believe me. I didn't do this." "I know," he replied softly, sitting across from her. "I'm working on it. But it's not just about you. They're coming after both of us." Valerie leaned forward, her voice rising. "Then fight back. I was humiliated in front of everyone. You need to show them who's in charge." "I can't fight without evidence," Jonathan said, frustration creeping into his tone. "Amanda is already positioning herself as the solution to the chaos." Valerie's eyes narrowed. "Amanda? She's behind this. I'm sure of it." Jonathan sighed. "She's ambitious, but we don't have proof." Valerie leaned back, her jaw tightening. "Then you'd better find it, Jonathan. Because if she's framing me to take you down, this isn't just about ambition, it's personal." Meanwhile, Amanda Clark was capitalizing on the chaos. At a press conference, she faced the cameras with an air of professionalism. "The incident involving Mrs. Valerie Adams is under investigation. We are committed to ensuring the safety and reputation of this airport. Do you think Director Adams should resign?" a reporter asked. Amanda's expression was carefully neutral. "Our focus is on restoring trust. That requires leadership capable of maintaining order." Her non-answer set off a media firestorm. Outside the airport, protests swelled. Some demanded justice for Valerie, while others accused Jonathan of enabling criminal activity. The staff inside the airport grew uneasy, whispers of Jonathan's waning authority rippling through the halls. At home, the tension between Jonathan and Valerie boiled over. "You need to go public," Valerie insisted, pacing the kitchen. "Expose Amanda for what she's doing." "And say what?" Jonathan snapped. "That we think she's framing you? That's not evidence. It's speculation. It'll make us look desperate." "Then get evidence," Valerie shot back, her voice sharp. "You're the director of this airport, Jonathan. Start acting like it." Jonathan slammed his hand on the counter, startling her. "Do you think I'm not trying? One wrong move, and this whole thing blows up even worse." Valerie's tone softened, but her words remained cutting. "Then maybe you shouldn't be in this position." The silence that followed was deafening. Jonathan turned away, his shoulders tense. "I'm trying to save us both," he said quietly. Valerie's voice dropped. "I just need you to believe in me. If you give up, I'm finished." Late that night, Jonathan sifted through hours of security footage, searching for anything unusual. The strain showed in his furrowed brow and tired eyes. Just as he was about to give up, his phone buzzed. The message read, "Mr. Adams, I have information about your wife's case. Meet me tomorrow at noon. Oscar Mitchell." Jonathan frowned. He recognized the name. Oscar was Amanda's assistant. He replied cautiously, agreeing to meet. The following day, Oscar entered Jonathan's office, holding a thick folder. The young man looked nervous, his hands trembling slightly as he placed the folder on the desk. "I shouldn't be here," Oscar began, his voice low, "but you need to know the truth about Amanda." Jonathan leaned forward. "What truth?" Oscar hesitated before gesturing to the folder. "She's working with people outside the airport. This whole thing, your wife, the drugs, it's part of her plan to discredit you." Jonathan opened the folder, scanning the documents. Photos, emails, and financial records painted a damning picture of Amanda's involvement in a scheme to plant drugs in passengers' luggage, specifically targeting Black travelers. "She's trying to force you out," Oscar said, "and if you don't act soon, she'll win." Jonathan closed the folder, his expression hardening. "Why are you telling me this?" Oscar hesitated. "Because I can't watch her destroy this place, or your family." Jonathan leaned back, his mind racing. This changes everything. Jonathan sat in his office, the weight of Oscar's revelations pressing down on him. The folder lay open on his desk, its contents an irrefutable roadmap of Amanda's scheme. Emails detailed her coordination with smugglers, photos showed her meeting suspicious figures, and audio recordings captured damning conversations. Oscar shifted uncomfortably across from him. "I know this isn't enough on its own," he said cautiously, "but it's a start." Jonathan looked up, his jaw tight. "This is more than a start, Oscar. It's proof. But if we're going to use it, we need to be strategic." Oscar nodded. "I'm willing to testify, but Amanda has allies. She'll come after both of us if she finds out I've turned on her." Jonathan's voice was steady but firm. "We'll keep this quiet, for now, but we'll need a public moment, something undeniable to expose her." Later that evening, Jonathan returned home, the tension in the air palpable. Protesters still surrounded the house, chanting slogans and waving signs. Inside, Valerie sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. She looked up as Jonathan entered. "Anything new?" she asked, her tone cautious. Jonathan placed the folder on the table. "I've got what we need. Proof Amanda is behind everything." Valerie's eyes widened as she flipped through the documents. "This is unbelievable," she murmured. "She's been working with smugglers for months." Jonathan nodded. "She's targeting black passengers, planting drugs to create chaos, all to undermine me and take control of the airport." Valerie's expression hardened. "We need to go public with this." "Not yet," Jonathan said quickly. "If we move too soon, she'll spin it against us. I need to bring this to the board first, on my terms." Valerie's lips pressed into a thin line. "You'd better not wait too long. She's already turned half the airport staff against you." The next day, Jonathan called an emergency board meeting. As he entered the conference room, Amanda was already there, her confident demeanor radiating control. Other board members watched him warily, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "What's this about, Jonathan?" Amanda asked, her tone cool. "You'll find out soon enough," he replied, setting up a projector. He pulled out a USB drive and inserted it into the laptop. "I've recently come across evidence that one of our senior staff members has been working against this organization." Amanda leaned back in her chair, feigning nonchalance. "That's a serious accusation. Who are you referring to?" Jonathan pressed play, and the room fell silent as an audio recording began to play. Amanda's voice filled the room. "We'll plant drugs in the luggage of black passengers to create chaos. The goal is to make Jonathan look incompetent and force him out. Once he's gone, we'll turn the airport into our largest trafficking hub." Gasps echoed through the room. Amanda's composure faltered as she sat upright. "This is absurd," she snapped. "That could be anyone's voice." Jonathan clicked again, displaying photos of Amanda meeting with known smugglers. "These photos suggest otherwise," he said. "And these emails sent from your personal account confirm your involvement." Amanda's face flushed as murmurs spread among the board members. "This is a setup," she hissed. "You're desperate to save yourself." Jonathan stood firm. "Desperate? Number determined to expose the truth." Before Amanda could respond, the door opened and two uniformed officers stepped inside. "Amanda Clark," one of them said, "you're under arrest for conspiracy and drug trafficking." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You can't do this. I'm innocent." The officers ignored her protests, handcuffing her as cameras from waiting journalists outside began to flash. The board watched in stunned silence as Amanda was escorted out. Later that evening, Jonathan and Valerie sat on their porch, the protest crowd now replaced by reporters asking for statements. Valerie looked at her husband, exhaustion and relief etched on her face. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," Jonathan corrected. "And it's not over yet. There's a lot of rebuilding to do." Valerie nodded. "At least now, we have a chance." News of Amanda Clark's arrest spread like wildfire, dominating headlines and sparking widespread public outrage. Deputy Director behind drug scheme exposed and black passengers targeted in shocking plot were splashed across every major media outlet. The once divided crowd outside the Adams home had dissolved, replaced by a quieter, more reflective atmosphere. Inside the house, Jonathan and Valerie sat together, their relief tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. This doesn't feel like a victory, Valerie said, staring at the stack of news articles on the table. Even with Amanda gone, the damage is already done. My name, our name, has been dragged through the mud. Jonathan rubbed his temples. It's going to take time to undo this, but we've got the truth on our side now. That's something. Valerie leaned back in her chair. Time isn't going to erase how people looked at me in that airport, or how they whispered when they thought I wasn't listening. Jonathan reached for her hand. We'll make them listen now. The next day, Jonathan returned to the airport for the first time since Amanda's arrest. The halls, once filled with whispers of doubt and resentment, were now silent. Staff members avoided his gaze, their discomfort palpable. As he stepped into his office, he found a stack of resignation letters waiting on his desk. Employees tied to Amanda's schemes, quietly exiting before investigations could implicate them. Oscar Mitchell, Amanda's former assistant, stood waiting by the window. I'm surprised you came back so soon, he said, his tone cautious. Jonathan sighed. I don't have the luxury of waiting. This place is in shambles. Oscar handed him a file. I've been going through the records Amanda tried to hide. There's a lot of cleanup to do. Financial irregularities, falsified reports. It's a mess. Jonathan nodded. I'm not surprised, but we'll handle it. I'll need you to step up, Oscar. You've proven you're willing to do the right thing, and I need someone I can trust. Oscar's eyes widened. You want me to stay? After everything? You risked everything to expose Amanda, Jonathan said. That's the kind of integrity this place needs. Oscar hesitated, then nodded. All right, I'm in. Meanwhile, Valerie faced her own battle. Despite her name being cleared, her arrest had left a deep scar on the community. Local activists who had once protested against her and Jonathan now sought meetings to discuss rebuilding trust. At a town hall meeting, Valerie stood before a skeptical crowd of mostly Black residents, many of whom had been directly impacted by the racial profiling Amanda orchestrated. I know I can't undo the harm that was done, Valerie began, her voice steady but earnest. But I can promise you this, I will fight to make sure no one else goes through what I did, and no one in our community will be targeted at this airport or anywhere else because of the color of their skin. A man in the crowd raised his hand. Why should we trust you now? You were part of the system that let this happen. Valerie met his gaze. Because I was a victim of that system too, and because I know how it feels to be judged unfairly. I won't stop fighting until things change, not just for me, but for all of us. Her words were met with scattered applause, a small but significant sign that the tide might be turning. Back at the airport, Jonathan faced the board. He presented a detailed plan to address the systemic failures Amanda had exploited. This included implementing stronger oversight measures, hiring an independent diversity consultant, and creating a task force to ensure fairness in passenger treatment. One board member, a man in his 60s with a skeptical expression, leaned forward. Director Adams, why should we believe you can fix this? Your leadership was questioned long before Amanda's actions came to light. Jonathan straightened in his seat. Because I've learned from this experience. I trusted the wrong people and let complacency take root. But I won't make that mistake again. This airport needs a leader willing to take responsibility, and that's what I'm here to do. The board deliberated for hours, and while some remained unconvinced, the majority ultimately voted to keep Jonathan in his position. That evening, as Jonathan and Valerie sat together on their porch, they allowed themselves a brief moment of peace. The road ahead was daunting, but for the first time in weeks, they felt like they had a fighting chance. You think they'll really let us rebuild? Valerie asked, watching the sun dip below the horizon. They don't have a choice, Jonathan said. The truth is out, and we've got the tools to make things right. It's just going to take time. Valerie nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. Then let's get to work. Months passed, and the scars of the scandal slowly began to heal. The airport, once mired in controversy, was transforming under Jonathan's leadership. The new policies he implemented had begun to rebuild trust. Mandatory sensitivity training for staff, increased oversight of security protocols, and the formation of an independent advisory board to address racial equity concerns. Valerie, too, found her footing. She had taken on a new role as a community advocate, working closely with local leaders to ensure systemic change extended beyond the airport. Through town halls, meetings, and public speaking engagements, she became a voice for accountability and reform. One day, Valerie visited the airport for the first time since her arrest. Her stomach churned as she walked through the security checkpoint, memories of Cole Peterson's sneer flashing in her mind. But this time, the atmosphere was different. A young black security officer greeted her warmly. "Mrs. Adams," he said with a smile, "we're glad to have you here today." His kindness eased her tension, and as she moved further into the terminal, she noticed a plaque mounted on the wall. It read, "In recognition of those who fought for fairness and equality in aviation." Below it were the names of those wrongfully targeted, including hers. Jonathan met her in the terminal, his tie slightly askew from a busy morning. "How does it feel to be back?" he asked. Valerie scanned the bustling scene, the passengers moving freely, the staff operating with newfound professionalism. "It feels like a fresh start," she said, "but there's still more to do." Jonathan nodded. "Always, but this is a step in the right direction." The following week, a press conference was held to announce the airport's new initiatives and celebrate the progress made under Jonathan's leadership. Journalists filled the room, their cameras aimed at the podium where Jonathan stood, flanked by Valerie and Oscar Mitchell, now the newly appointed deputy director. Jonathan spoke with conviction. What happened here was unacceptable. It exposed not only failures in leadership, but also systemic issues that have plagued our society for far too long. But today, we're showing that accountability and change are possible. Valerie stepped forward next. "This isn't just about one airport or one community. This is about creating a world where no one has to face the kind of humiliation, discrimination, or injustice that so many of us have endured. And we won't stop until that world is a reality." Her words were met with thunderous applause, the crowd rising to their feet in support. For the first time, Valerie felt a sense of closure, not because the fight was over, but because they were no longer fighting alone. At home that evening, Jonathan and Valerie sat on their porch, watching the sunset in silence. The air was cool, carrying the distant hum of the neighborhood settling in for the night. "You know," Jonathan began, his voice soft, "there were moments when I thought we wouldn't get here, that it would all fall apart." Valerie leaned against his shoulder. "Me too, but we didn't let it. We fought for it." He turned to her, his expression serious. "Do you think it's enough? Everything we've done?" Valerie smiled faintly. "It's a start, and sometimes a start is all you need." They sat together as the sky faded to twilight, their hands intertwined. Though the road ahead would still have challenges, they faced it together, with resilience, purpose, and hope. The Adams efforts had far-reaching effects. The airport became a model for inclusivity and fairness, and Jonathan's leadership inspired similar reforms in airports across the country. Valerie's advocacy work grew into a national movement, amplifying the voices of those who had been silenced. Oscar Mitchell, now in a leadership role, worked tirelessly alongside Jonathan to ensure that Amanda's corruption left no lasting stain on the airport. Together, they turned what was once a source of shame into a symbol of progress. The Adams story wasn't just one of survival, it was one of transformation. And as they continued their journey, they carried with them a simple but powerful truth. Even in the face of the darkest challenges, change is always possible when you refuse to give up.